October 9, 1997. 8:45 a.m. Bala, Ontario. It was a home for the criminally insane. It was also a home for the dying. Plus, they served frozen yogurt, which they called frogurt. A man sat in a wheelchair, eyes staring straight ahead, seeing nothing. Atop his head was an old and battered bowler hat. A prim and proper nurse approached him and rolled up his sleeve. She pulled back the plunger on the needle and prepared to give him the injection. Suddenly the man turned and looked her straight in the eye. "Ya ever been to Bala?" was his only question. The nurse screamed. October 12, 1997. 3:14 p.m. Somewhere in geostationary orbit. Tip pulled back on the throttle for his two-man spacecraft and set the ship into hover mode. He would be able to observe the planet from here. He glanced up at the flashing control panel. The signal had been transmitting for 3 days now. Teddy was perplexed. It was a signal meant for him, but he had only received it by accident. It seemed fortuitous that he had gotten it all. Tip glanced down at the floor of the craft. Another figure lay sleeping, a gentle snore sounding. "Anne," called Tip. The woman did not stir. "Raggedy," he called again. She was silent. Tip kicked her. She got to her feet, her long red dreadlocks hanging to her waist. "What is it?" she moaned in a sing-song voice. Tip turned and looked at the planet Earth, hanging silently in space. "Ya been to Bala?" he asked. October 13, 1997. 11:42 a.m. Janesville, Wisconsin. Karen Marango kneeled in her garden, planting tulips. Tom came out of the house, an apron tied around his waist. The apron read, "Kiss me, I'm Greek." He was carrying a tray of sugar wafers and milk. He set it down next to Karen and looked at her. She was still ignoring him. It had been this way for years now. Ever since, well, he hated to think about it. Too painful. Suddenly Karen straightened up. She turned, and for the first time in 6 years, looked at Tom. "I'm going to Bala," were the first words he'd heard her say in a long time. October 14, 1997. 2:10 a.m. An uncharted island off of the Ivory Coast. Trudy and CT lay naked on the beach, the ocean waves splashing over their bodies and occasionally drenching them in seaweed. CT traced a finger up Trudy's toe and playfully tickled the bottom of her feet. Trudy giggled and plunged her foot into his chest, sending him flying back into the surf. They laughed. These were good times. Suddenly Trudy got to her feet. CT strode from the waves and went to embrace her. She felt strangely cold. "Buttercups." "What's wrong?" said CT. "Bala calls. I must answer." Trudy pushed CT back into the water and made her way to their cave to prepare to leave. A seagull flew overhead. October 14, 1997. 9:32 p.m. The Gotham Cineplex, Gotham City. "Holy crapola, Batman," exclaimed Robin, as he and Batman exited the theater. "Yes, old chum. That George Clooney is no superhero." They walked to the Batmobile. Unfortunately, small children and animals were hanging around the vehicle, pens and paper in hands. "Holy autograph." "What do they want?" said Robin, beginning to perspire. "Don't worry. I've got just the solution." Batman reached into his bat belt and removed a small container. He shook it for a few moments and then walked into the throng of children and animals, spraying the contents of the container into their faces. The children and animals began gasping for air and fell to the ground, obviously dead. Batman and Robin hopped into the Batmobile and started the engine. Robin made some sort of guttural exclamation and pointed. A little yellow sticky note was hanging from the dash. Batman tore it from the dash and looked at it. His jaw jutted forward, and he showed the note to Robin. It said one word, which both men said aloud. Bala. The Batmobile sped off into the night. October 15, 1997. 7:58 a.m. 6:33 South Jackson, Janesville, Wisconsin. Mrs. Lowe Pepper stared at the clock. It was almost time for classes to begin and Marengo wasn't here. Ever since they had made peace with one another and had the school rebuilt exactly the way it had been before, right down to the cracked glass in the back hallway, she had come to rely on Marengo's promptness in the morning. Today, apparently, was the exception. Mrs. Lowe Pepper stepped into the classroom. A new generation of students sat at their desks, furtively getting a jump start on their work for the day. These students were prime examples of what good discipline and sexual favors could do. "Has anyone seen Mrs. Marengo?" she asked aloud. The class shook their head in unison. Their eyes stared at her, blinking in unison. From behind her, Mrs. Lowe Pepper heard someone cough. She spun around, eyes flashing, and fixed her sights on the rebellious child. "Dishwashing duty for you," she screamed hysterically, the vein bulging. The child meekly got up and made his way to the kitchen. Suddenly, the children sat erect. Their eyes got a glazed look to them. Mrs. Lowe Pepper felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: fear. She stepped backwards, stumbled, and fell into the bookcase which lined the far end of the classroom. The children's mouths were moving but saying nothing. She seemed to be shaking, almost convulsing. Mrs. Lowe Pepper pulled herself to her feet, with some difficulty I might add, and grabbed the nearest child. She began to shake the child violently. The trance was broken. The child looked up at her, eyes wide with fear. "Bala," spoke the child. Mrs. Lowe Pepper felt the hairs on the back of her neck, chin, and ears stand on end. Class dismissed. October 16, 1997. 12:04 p.m. The Capitol Building, Madison, Wisconsin. The door to the office was ajar. The name on the office door read Brian C. DeGolier, Private Investigator. A perky, well, parts of her were perky, blonde sat at the desk next to the door entrance. She was chewing bubble gum and doing her nails. The phone on her desk rang, long and shrill. She ignored it. It rang again. She rolled her eyes and picked up the receiver. "DeGolier Investigations, this is Candy. How can I help you?" she said, her thick New York accent shining through, bold and strong. Her eyes suddenly widened in fear and she dropped the nail file. She stood up, letting the phone receiver crash to the desk. "Mr. DeGolier," she screamed. Brian sat in his office, a plane ticket in his hands. The ticket was stamped with two words, in bold type: "Destination, Bala." "And so it begins," intoned Brian, putting on his trench coat and hat and heading for the door. He paused in the doorway. "Candy, call Inspector McGilligan. Tell him I've solved the mystery of the mysterious deaths on St. John's Dock." It was Biddy McGraw. She strangled her men with the straps of her bra. "I'll be out of town for a while." With that, he left. October 16, 1997. 3:07 p.m. The Boss Abbas Show Studios, New York City, New York. Our guest today is Mr. Arthur Frampton. Mr. Frampton has 3 buttocks. Let's give him a warm round of applause. The little applause lights began flashing and the studio audience clapped on cue. Al made his way down the stage, mic in hand, towards the gentleman making his way towards the chair in the center of the stage. Al shook his hand and turned to the audience. "Welcome to the Boss Abbas Show." The audience cheered. Al beamed from ear to ear and began his opening monologue. He ran through interminable chatter about scientific methods to cure tributochism and then opened the lines for the audience at home to call in. "Caller, are you there?" said Al. "Yeah, hi, I'd like to order a large pizza with extra cheese and mushroom for delivery." Al laughed a fake laugh. "I'm sorry sir, but you've reached the wrong number. Next caller. The line was silent. Al's forehead broke into a cold sweat. He hated days like this. Ever since he became a talk show host and won all the ratings from the likes of Rosie and Oprah, he had had to contend with days like this where nothing went right. Hello? Caller. Are you there? The sound of deep breathing. A gasp for air. The word. Bala. Al went totally white, the blood draining from his face in a matter of seconds. Cut to commercial, shouted the director. Al dropped the mic and ran for the exit. October 17, 1997. 4:17 p.m. Oak Hill Cemetery, Janesville, Wisconsin. The sky appeared threatening. The black clouds bubbled and boiled angrily, borne along on the cold wind. Carla knelt at the grave. The tombstone bore a name, Billy. Carla wept openly. Across the cemetery, next to a yellow Lamborghini, stood a man, dressed in all black. The man whose grave Carla visited was his brother. But he felt no sorrow for his brother's death. It had only been beneficial in his obtaining the true object of his desire, Carla Whipperforth. The wind began to pick up considerably. Carla found it difficult to keep her hair looking neat and proper. She decided it was time to leave and stood up. She glanced at the man in black who stood next to the Lamborghini. She knew she was only with him because both of her true loves were dead or long gone. He had told her that Billy had always wanted her to be with him should Billy died. Carla regretted shooting Billy more than ever now. And besides, what was up with him insisting she call him Brusty, Dark Overlord every time she came home from working at the Gap? Suddenly the ground began to shake. Lightning flashed brightly and the winds whipped up such a force that even Carla's hair-sprayed helmet hair was beginning to quiver. There was another bright flash which blinded Carla momentarily, and suddenly a very familiar figure was standing in front of her. "Jimmy," she gushed, running into his arms. Brusty began moving quickly towards the embracing pair. Anger was in his eyes. He was reaching into his back pocket for the serrated knife. Jimmy suddenly whipped out a tape deck. He pressed play. "I love you, you love me, we're all one big family." Brusty fell to his knees, screaming in pain. Smoke was seeping from the sleeves and neck of his black outfit. "No. Not Barney," he screamed. Jimmy cranked the song up louder. Brusty gave one loud shriek of pain and disappeared in an explosion of fire and smoke. "He'll be back," warned Carla. "I know." "Oh, Jimmy. Where have you been?" sobbed Carla. "Well, depends on who you talk to and what you've read. To be honest, I'm not sure. It's all a blur after 1993. I think I remember something about parallel universes, loads o' Als and Brians and that wretch Low Pepper. All that matters is that you're here now. With me." "To hell with continuity," gushed Carla, ecstatically kissing Jimmy. Jimmy pushed her away, slapped her gently and said, "I've come for other things than that, dear." Carla felt goosebumps form on her arms. "Bala," she whispered, barely able to say the word. "Bala," replied Jimmy. He turned away from her and looked up at the dark sky. "We leave in an hour. But first, we need to make a few stops." October 17, 1997. 5:01 p.m. 514 Sinister Way, Bala, Ontario. The man sat at an ornate oak desk, in a dark room. The only source of light came from one lone candle, burning dimly next to an antique phone. The man's eyes were sunken and hollow, almost lifeless. He reached forward and picked up the phone receiver. He slowly dialed a number and leaned back in the chair, taking a drag from the long cigarette he produced from seemingly nowhere. Someone answered. "Buds Bolarama. Can I help you?" "Yes, do you have 10-pound balls?" "Yes." "You should see a doctor then." The man slammed down the phone and exclaimed, "God, I love doing that." October 17, 1997. 5:48 p.m. Woodman's Grocery Store, Janesville, Wisconsin. Dovey toilet tissue? Questioned Carla. Jimmy nodded and said, "It's like you're using nothing at all." He threw it into the grocery cart. Carla looked at the contents. They didn't seem to make sense. Toilet tissue, 2 reams of typing paper, plastic forks, 4 boxes of straws, wax paper, charcoal briquettes, the latest issue of Teen Beat with Hanson on the cover. Well, Carla had insisted they get that one, and a bottle of pickled beets. Carla was about to ask Jimmy what they were all for when the two turned the corner of an aisle, their cart running into another person's cart. Jimmy and Carla were about to apologize when they realized who was driving the other cart, Mrs. Low Pepper. Low Pepper's response was immediate. She pushed her cart viciously forward, causing Jimmy and Carla to fall to the floor. Mrs. Low Pepper then lifted her cart high above her head, ready to bring it crashing down on the helpless forms of Jimmy and Carla. Jimmy thought quick and unscrewed the jar of pickled beets. He sent the jar rolling down the aisle. Low Pepper paused, sniffing the air with long protracted grunts. A small figure suddenly rushed Low Pepper and sent her sprawling, the cart crashing to the ground next to her. The small figure jumped atop her chest and began punching her stomach. "Galileo!" exclaimed Jimmy and Carla in unison. Jimmy's former sidekick turned, jumped off Low Pepper and said in that tiny little voice of his, "Run, Mr. Jimmy and Ms. Carla. She is only winded." Jimmy grabbed Carla's hand and dragged her past the Woodman's manager, who has finally come to investigate the disturbance in aisle 7. Galileo threw some money at the manager to pay for the damage and ran after the retreating pair. The stunned manager moved to Low Pepper's side, saying, "Can I help you, miss?" To this day, Woodman's patrons still swear they can hear that sound of a man being eaten alive. Meanwhile, Jimmy, Carla and Galileo rushed outside. Carla stopped and pointed in the distance. "Look. It's the invocation of ancient powers over by the new Sears." The trio got into Carla's Lamborghini and raced to the mall, breaking several speed records and wounding a small group of children from a nearby Christian school taking a field trip to, well, the field next to Woodman's. When they arrived, they saw a small girl standing in the parking lot, dusting herself off. She frowned when she saw Jimmy. "Mary Lou," exclaimed Jimmy, incredulous. "Yeah, hi. I got this message on my answering machine. Something about Bala." "What the hell is Bala?" "There's no time to explain. Quick, hop in. We're off to O'Hare." October 17, 1997. 6:25 p.m. The forests of Bala, Bala, Ontario. Tip finished locking up the spacecraft and walked to the clearing where Anne had gathered some supplies she'd found in the forest. "Did you find everything?" he asked. "Toilet tissue, 2 reams of typing paper, plastic forks, 4 boxes of straws, wax paper, charcoal briquettes, and a bottle of pickled beets." "What is all this stuff for?" she inquired. "Did you get Dovey toilet tissue?" he demanded. "Yes," she replied, rolling her eyes. "Good. Now we wait." October 17, 1997. 8:14 p.m. O'Hare Airport, Terminal 14, Chicago, Illinois. "Our flight leaves in 16 minutes. Said Galileo, striding back from the ticket desk. "Good," said Jimmy. Carla suddenly gasped and pointed. The group turned. Jimmy smiled broadly. A man was walking towards them, arms outstretched, bottles of liquor in hand. "Al," they exclaimed in unison. The reunion was brief yet exciting for all involved. "I take it we're all here for the same reason?" questioned Al, finally. "What do you think?" snapped Carla. "Don't get uppity with me, you pompous self-important twit." Displaying long pent-up aggressions, "Al," said Galileo. "Maybe," sniffed Al. October 17, 1997. 8:27 p.m. O'Hare Airport, Flight 741, Chicago, Illinois. Lo Pepper sat in her seats, fidgeting. The air stewardess was distributing literature. Mrs. Lo Pepper asked for a copy of Young Students in Love, but they were all out. A voice suddenly called out her name. She turned in her seat to see Karen Marengo carting a huge duffel bag up the aisle towards her. She took the remainder of the seat left next to Lo Pepper and sighed. "Headed for Bala?" Marengo questioned. "Of course. Missed you in class yesterday. How's Tom?" "Whipped. The usual." Lo Pepper and Marengo did a high five. Silence. "Jimmy and Carla have joined forces again." Marengo frowned and clenched her fists together. "I guess those life packs weren't enough for them. I see we're going to have to teach them brand new lessons." They chortled long and hard. October 17, 1997. 10:02 p.m. Flight 133, somewhere over Montana. Carla was pointing out the window in excitement. "Not another monster on the wing, I hope," muttered Al under his breath. Al looked and smiled. The Bat rocket was flying alongside their airplane, doing loop-de-loops and spelling out swear words in the sky. "This is good. Our little elite group is growing larger and larger. I wonder who else has heard the call," said Jimmy, rubbing his hands together with glee. October 17, 1997. 10:07 p.m. Bat rocket, somewhere over Montana. Robin was getting bored playing Bat Tetris on the Bat computer and looked out a nearby window. He began tugging on Batman's cape, making little scared sounds. "Baba Batman, what's that?" he said, pointing outside. Batman sighed and muttered to himself, "Not another falling sphere of ice." Batman peered out the window. He could see a man, dressed in a long black trench coat and wearing a hat, flying in the air. The man seemed to be sitting on air. "Oh, that's Brian in his invisible plane," said Batman. Robin stared out the window and then back at Batman. "Like Wonder Woman?" "Yes, like Wonder Woman." Brian was grinning and waving. October 17, 1997. 11:18 p.m. The frozen wasteland of Bala, Ontario. A figure trudged on through the snowy wastes. Behind her was an enormous pack of timber wolves. They followed her close and nudged her on when she stumbled. The figure stopped and removed the hood of her Esprit parka and surveyed her surroundings. "We are close. Soon, Bala will be at hand," Trudy called to the wolves. They howled in excitement. October 18, 1997. 1:14 a.m. Hooters, Bala, Ontario. The group had just placed their orders and were now discussing recent events. The reunion for some had been bittersweet. Carla had given Batman and Robin the cold shoulder since they'd met again. Robin had seemed anxious to pick up where they had left off, but Carla was quick to remind him that she didn't care what his book claimed, those tights just didn't do it for her. Carla and Trudy's reunion had even been more strained. Carla had inquired about CT and Jimmy, and Brian had had to hold Trudy back. Trudy had made some veiled threat about "get shot in the wilderness, babe," and sulked off to her own table. Her wolves sat with her, looking hungrily at the waitress as she took their order. Brian and Al had fallen into a deep discussion about quantum particles in flux, and the others, sensing this was above their heads, had left them alone. Batman and Robin had tried to ask some questions about Brian's invisible plane, but he shunned them. Meanwhile, Carla, Jimmy and Mary Lou sat at a table discussing strategies. "You know who it was that summoned us, right?" asked Jimmy. Carla nodded and said TR. Mary Lou's face tightened with anger. "TR is someone I've battled for centuries but never really known much about. It's almost as if he's appeared by convenience and then disappeared before I could learn more. I've found it most irritating. I met someone a long time ago who held a connection to TR. I didn't mention anything at the time, but I felt sure that eventually, he would lead us to the truth about TR. I don't know his name. I know he was involved with a horrible woman named Finkel and that he talks incessantly, but that's all. The last time I saw him was in Paris. I thought he had been killed by the firing squad, but to be honest, I'm not sure what happened after the cop told his men to open fire on us. Everything after that gets fuzzy, and I think there's temporal displacement involved. Oh, I hate that!" exclaimed Carla. "The thing I don't understand, the thing I've never understood, is what or who TR is. For the longest time, I thought he was Teddy Ruxpin. Then I thought he might be Tip Ruck-Erman. You do know Tip, right?" said Mary Lou. "Best porta-potty salesman in the quadrant." "Agree, Jimmy." So there seem to be a lot of inconsistencies about this whole thing. I wish someone would go back and clean it all up and try and make sense out of it. "Geesh, could you imagine the time that would take?" called out Al from nearby. He must have been listening in. "So, let's make sure we all understand this," spoke Jimmy loudly, so everyone could hear. "TR is not Tip Ruck-Erman or Teddy Ruxpin. TR's some unknown entity with strange powers as yet explained or known of. We know TR's a bad egg, but we're not sure why or what part exactly we all play in this." Everyone grunted in agreement. Trudy's wolves licked themselves. "So what do we do next?" "Well, we eat our dinner, ogle the waitress, and then go off and find our destiny in the forest of Bala." Everyone nodded.